All right, so welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive.
Absolutely.
And today we're going global, taking a look at well, I guess you could call it the heart of global trade, a place where fortunes are made and lost, based on the price of metals. We're talking about the London Metal Exchange, the LME. Ever heard of it?
I have.
Well, get this. This centuries-old institution in London
Yeah.
might just hold the key to understanding China's role in today's global economy. It's a wild story. Definitely a few twists and turns along the way. But we've got a stack of research, articles, personal notes, all to help us guide our way through this.
It's really fascinating how the fate of the LME is so closely connected to, well, the rise of new economic powerhouses, particularly in Asia.
Yeah. And to really unravel that mystery, we need to kind of go back in time a bit, understand how London became such a powerhouse for commodity trading in the first place. So imagine London in the 1800s, right in the peak of the colonial era. Ships from all over the world are docking in this bustling port, bringing goods from every corner of the globe. I mean, London was the epicenter of global trade.
It was. And it was within that environment, back in 1877, that the London Metal Exchange was born, starting with copper, and then quickly expanding to include other base metals like tin, aluminum, nickel, zinc, and lead.
Wow, so even today, the LME is still the main stage for setting the price of metals worldwide. Billions of dollars worth of metal contracts are traded here daily. And those decisions, well, they have a ripple effect across the globe, impacting industries like construction, electronics, even the cars we drive.
Absolutely. Just to give you an idea of the scale, back in 2017, over 140 million tons of metals were traded on the LME. That's more than double the amount traded just a decade earlier.
That's mind-blowing. Okay, so we get that London was this huge trade hub, but what made it the place for metal trading? What were the specific advantages that drew all the traders to this particular city?
Well, I mean, beyond the history, London had this really robust financial infrastructure. Think institutions like the Bank of England. It provided that stability and access to capital that, well, that traders need.
Right, it's like having a rock-solid foundation for your business.
Exactly. And of course, as a major port city, London had this direct access to the physical commodities being traded, which was absolutely crucial in the early days.
Right, so much easier to trade something you can actually see and touch.
Exactly. But as trade evolved, the LME had to as well.
Yeah.
So they introduced all these financial tools like derivatives and futures markets, allowing for more complex ways to manage risk. So these innovations, they made London even more attractive to international traders looking for sophisticated ways to, well, to protect their investments and increase their profits.
So it's not just about buying and selling metal anymore. It's about using financial instruments to manage risk and make some pretty savvy bets on future prices.
You got it. And another key factor was London's reputation for transparency and really clear regulations. Thanks to the Financial Conduct Authority, the FCA, that regulatory framework made sure everyone was playing by the same rules, creating this more stable and trustworthy market that attracted investors from around the globe.
But then things took a pretty dramatic turn. Remember that mystery we mentioned earlier? About China's role. Well, a major clue is in 2012, when the LME was acquired by the Hong Kong Exchanges and Clearing, or HKEX, for a whopping 1.4 billion pounds. And this wasn't just some business deal. This was a seismic shift that signaled, well, a new era for the LME and potentially the entire metals market.
Absolutely. And it's almost impossible to understand that acquisition without considering China's growing influence on the global stage.
This is where things get really interesting. On the surface, it looks like just a simple business transaction. The HKX bought the LME, brought in fresh capital, access to advanced technology, helping the exchange to modernize and reach a wider audience. But there's so much more to this story.
Right. This acquisition gave the HKEX, and by extension, China, this direct line to the booming Asian metals market, especially the incredible demand coming from China itself.
So it was a strategic power move by China to gain a foothold in the global metals market.
Well, that's one way to look at it. This acquisition propelled the HKEX, and arguably China, into a position of global financial influence. And, well, it sent shockwaves through the international community, especially in the United States.
I can only imagine suddenly China, through HKEX, had a much stronger voice in determining global metal prices. And I know there were some concerns raised in the U.S. about this acquisition. Could you tell us more about that?
Sure. Well, some U.S. policymakers and businesses, they started to worry about potential issues, like whether China might try to exert too much influence over global metal prices, or if market transparency would be affected.
That makes sense. I mean, if you're used to being a major player in a market and then suddenly another powerful player comes in, you're naturally going to wonder how the game's going to change.
Exactly. But, it's important to note that the LME continued to operate effectively
Mhm.
under its existing rules and regulations. So it maintained that reputation for transparency.
And the U.S., ever the adaptable player, diversified its trading strategies, right?
Absolutely. So while the HKEX acquisition definitely sparked a wave of concern and debate, I think the overall impact on the market, well, it was more nuanced than some of those initial reactions suggested.
Yeah, so we talked about the concerns, but what was the actual impact of this HKEX acquisition? How did China's influence on the metals market actually change in the years that followed?
Well, it's important to remember that before the acquisition, China, even though it was the biggest consumer of metals, it didn't really have much direct say in setting those global metal prices. The HKEX acquisition really changed that dynamic.
So, like going from being a passenger to having a hand on the steering wheel.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. Um, the acquisition gave China, through HKEX, a much more powerful voice in the global metals market. We're not talking about taking over control, but rather this increased participation and influence.
Right, that makes sense. So, how did this shift actually play out? What kind of changes did we see on the ground?
One of the most noticeable changes was this surge in participation from Chinese companies on the LME. Think major players like the State Grid, China National Petroleum Corporation, and huge aluminum producers like Chalco. They became a lot more active on the exchange.
So, they were taking advantage of the LME's global reach and using those sophisticated tools to protect their own interests.
Exactly. This increased participation gave Chinese companies, more direct access to vital market information and allowed them to have a bigger impact on shaping global metal prices. We also started to see global metal prices reflecting Chinese demand more accurately.
So, that sounds like a pretty significant change. Did this shift also affect China's position within the global metals supply chain?
Absolutely. I mean, before the acquisition, China relied heavily on exchanges like the LME for information about the metal market. But after the acquisition, they solidified their position as a leader in the global metal supply chain. It wasn't just a big consumer anymore, it was a dominant producer and distributor.
Like they went from playing on one side of the field to controlling both sides of the game.
In a way, yeah. The acquisition made it easier for China to access futures and options contracts on the LME. And this, in turn, increased the liquidity of metals and further bolstering China's role in global supply chains.
Okay, so we've got China's increased influence on pricing, their dominance in the supply chain. What else should we consider?
Well, we have to look at the impact on global metal prices themselves. I mean, the LME prices, which are considered the global benchmark. They started fluctuating more in response to changes in Chinese demand.
Could you give us an example of how that played out in the real world?
Sure. Let's say there's this huge construction boom happening in China. This means they need a lot of copper. And that demand drives up copper prices on the LME. And because the LME sets the benchmark, everyone feels this price hike, not just China. Suddenly, that copper wiring needed for your new house, or even the components in your smartphone, it all costs more.
So the LME basically became like this gauge for how healthy the Chinese economy was doing.
Precisely. Strong demand for metals in China often points to economic growth, while drops in prices might suggest a slowdown.
Yeah.
This makes the LME a crucial indicator for businesses and policymakers all around the world.
Wow, the ripple effects of this acquisition are pretty amazing. The HKEX purchase really did shake things up in the metals market.
It did. And it also had a noticeable impact on Hong Kong's role as a financial hub.
Oh, tell me more about that.
Well, Hong Kong has always been this gateway for international finance in Asia, and the LME acquisition just made that position even stronger. It solidified Hong Kong's links to the global financial system and made it a key player in the metals market.
So China essentially used Hong Kong as a springboard to achieve its financial ambitions.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. The acquisition gave China, through its connection to Hong Kong, better access to global metal markets, valuable data, and all those sophisticated trading mechanisms we talked about earlier.
This is all so fascinating. It's like a high-stakes game of chess, with each move impacting the global economy.
It is, and it's a game that's constantly evolving.
Okay, so before we move on to what all of this means for the future, let's quickly recap what we've learned so far. We started with London's historical dominance in trade, saw how the HKEX acquisition signaled a shift in global power dynamics, and explored how China leveraged this acquisition to become a major force in the global metals market.
We also talked about how the LME, with its roots in London, continues to be this key player in setting global metal prices. But there's no denying that the landscape has definitely changed with the HKEX acquisition. China's influence is now a significant factor in how the LME functions and how those prices are set.
And this is just the beginning. We've got a lot more to uncover, so stay tuned as we continue our deep dive. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground, but I think the biggest question lingering in my mind, and probably in the minds of our listeners, is this. What does it all mean? The LME, the HKEX acquisition, China's rising influence. How does it all fit into the bigger picture of the global economy?
Well, that is the key question, isn't it? Even with China's growing influence, the LME is still this vital indicator of global economic health. I
Yeah.
mean, when its prices fluctuate, industries and governments around the world, they take notice.
So even though the players have changed, the game itself is still the same. The LME is still the place to look for clues about what's happening in the global economy.
Exactly. The LME's prices, they reflect this complex interplay of factors. Supply and demand, geopolitical events, technological advancements, you name it. It's like a microcosm of all the forces shaping the global metals market.
I get the concept, but can you give me a concrete example? How would someone actually use the LME to get a read on the global economy?
Okay, let's say you're a company that manufactures electronics. You need copper to make your products, right?
Right.
If you see copper prices on the LME going up, it could mean a couple of things. Maybe there's a construction boom happening somewhere in the world. Or perhaps the demand for electric vehicles is increasing, both of which, of course, require a lot of copper. Either way, that rising copper price, it's a signal that global demand is high, and that's going to affect your production costs and ultimately your bottom line.
So it's like a giant flashing sign telling you where the economic action is.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And of course, the opposite is true as well. Falling metal prices might suggest a global economic slowdown, maybe less manufacturing or construction activity. These price movements on the LME, they offer valuable insights into the health of various industries and, the world economy as a whole.
Okay, that makes sense. But I'm still trying to wrap my head around the larger implications. What does the LME's evolution, especially the HKEX acquisition, what does that really tell us about how power is shifting in the global economy?
It really points to a fundamental change. A rebalancing, if you will. I mean, for centuries, Western institutions like the LME, they dominated global trade. But now, we're witnessing the rise of new economic powerhouses, particularly in Asia. The HKEX acquisition. It's a very tangible example of that shift.
So it's not just about metals, it's about a changing world order.
Precisely. The LME's journey reflects a much broader trend. China's influence is growing, and not just in metals. This growth, it's reshaping global supply chains, trade patterns, financial markets.
That's a lot to think about. So where do we go from here? What's the next chapter in this story?
Well, that is the million-dollar question, isn't it? The global trade landscape, it's constantly in flux. New technologies, geopolitical events, economic forces, they're all shaping the future. But one thing we can say for sure is that the LME, with its long history and this ability to adapt, it will continue to be a major player in this unfolding narrative.
We certainly covered a lot of ground today, from London's historical dominance to China's rise as this global economic force, explored price fluctuations, supply chains, even touched on the changing balance of power in the world. It's been quite a journey.
It has. And as always, the learning doesn't stop here. We encourage you, our listeners, to keep digging into these topics, explore the complexities of global trade, and think about what these shifts in power mean for our interconnected world.
And to leave you with a final thought, we'll end with a question. As China's influence continues to grow, how will the LME and the global metals market, how will they need to adapt and evolve? What role will new technologies like blockchain and artificial intelligence play in shaping the future of this industry? The answers, well, they're still being written, but one thing's for sure, it's going to be a fascinating ride. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive on A&E.